Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, there is consequences for a doctor trying to prescribe a miracle cure for COVID, positive news in relationship to liver transplants, and transplants in general, especially those for parts of your body that aren't typically transplanted. A case study of a woman who seems to have pissed off every deity under the sun. They had both breast infections and cancer after weeks of pain. And the world's fastest supercomputer. These and other news items can be found at the timestamps given in the description box below. Let's start with doctors getting their due rewards after COVID. This doctor from San Diego in America has been claiming that giving patients hydroxychloroquine will cure them of COVID. They describe it as a miracle cure. For anyone who's ever had even the slightest degree of skepticism, the notion of a miracle cure should be a massive red flag. We are talking RPG or dating sim levels of red flag. The doctor is being prosecuted on the basis that they're trying to give this as a treatment despite a lack of any kind of medical evidence at the moment that supports its use. The reality is that in the early days of COVID, you could have made some kind of argument based on the literature that was emerging, but so much of that literature now has either been debunked, found to be fraudulent, or withdrawn for other reasons. This means there is nigh on nothing to support its use. No doctor who is practicing evidence-based medicine would be prescribing it for that reason. It's given for other conditions, for example, lupus and rheumatoid arthritis, but that's because it plays a role in moderating the immune system for those conditions. You'll note that at no point have we ever said that it's been used, approved, or otherwise allowed for COVID under the current circumstances. This is where the not only emails trying to solicit patients, but the actual prescription led to the doctor being given 30 days in prison and a year of home confinement. Honestly, it seemed like, from what this doctor was pitching hydroxychloroquine as, it should be Dr. Oz, but this is not. This is a different doctor trying to pull unscrupulous behavior. The undercover investigation found that they described hydroxychloroquine as being a magic bullet and an amazing cure that could keep someone immune from COVID for at least 6 weeks. Those are very bold claims and entirely unfounded. And this is why they are now spending time in jail. Predating on people's fear of the unknown, or in this case, a pandemic, is not a good way to get business going, and this is his upcomings for doing so. In other medical news that is actually useful and relevant, but more importantly, backed up by evidence, is the ability to get more oxygen into the bloodstream. All of the oxygen that's currently in your body has found its way down your respiratory tract, into the lungs, through the epithelium, and into hemoglobin. There is a small amount that gets dissolved in your blood itself, but just about all of it is in the hemoglobin. This is obviously a problematic process. It has to travel through a lot of different vessels in order to get into the blood eventually. If you have any limitations between your mouth and nose and the alveoli in your lungs, chances are that you won't get good oxygen absorption. And this is one of the biggest barriers, especially with COVID-19, where getting the amount of oxygen patients need into them was often nigh on impossible. This is why ventilators became necessary. If you could try and get oxygen into the bloodstream intravenously, you could, to a certain extent, avoid many of these problems. The problem is, you can't put gas, notably oxygen in this case, into blood without killing someone. A gas embolus is still an embolus and will cause issues. This is one reason why intravenous oxygenation is not an option. It's also why this particular development is very important. The way it works is to fundamentally break up the oxygen gas into such tiny bubbles that they are smaller than red blood cells. Therefore, they're able to dissolve within the bloodstream itself and not create the big bolus effect that can have the adverse effects of gas in blood. Doing this way also means that over time the oxygen can be picked up by the red blood cells and swapped out for CO2. This provides not only options for treatment of patients who have need of oxygen, but also benefits when it comes to things like transfusions. Broadly speaking, blood that is transfused tends to have below 20% oxygen in it. This is nowhere near enough to be functional for the human body, and it takes time to circulate back around to the lungs and be re-oxygenated. This technique would theoretically allow for the blood to be up to 95% oxygenated before being transfused. This means that it's almost as good as being oxygenated blood of your own body's making. The animal models they were testing this in weren't as effective, let's say. They had a range of between 20 and 50% saturation, so their proof of concept does show it works, and that it does provide, let's say, better results than transfused blood without any additional treatment, but it's also not as good. This simply means that it's currently something that can be incorporated into future technology, or developed to be its own standalone device. If COVID has taught us nothing else, then it's the importance of medicine overall. One of the things that we haven't really had any way to touch on during COVID has been organ donations. One of the big challenges with organs has always been how much distance there is between a possible donor and recipient. This is on top of issues around the number of donors, the suitability of donors, the suitability of recipients, the fact that recipients may or may not be able to adhere to requirements before getting donation, and so on. If you were to account for all of the other factors, the logistical considerations of getting an organ from a donor to a recipient in under 12 hours is often the big challenge. Any more than 12 hours and you'll find that the organ begins to break down. With that in mind, if you could extend that time frame, it's arguable that you could increase the number of possible recipients. This is why research that livers in particular could be viable for several days rather than 12 hours is a big discovery. The claim is that livers could be preserved for 3 days before being transplanted. That means that there shouldn't be any reason why a suitable recipient could not be found for any viable donated liver. Here's where we need to start piling salt onto these claims. The first is that the study involved a single liver transplant, so this is an incredibly small sample size, verging on anecdotal. Second, the liver was deemed unviable, as it had come from someone who had a tumour in that liver, and they also had sepsis. These conditions had to be dealt with before a transplant could occur, and this is why that time frame was available, and how they found out 3 days could work. The person who received it, a year later, the recipient was perfectly healthy and their donated liver was perfectly functional. This is how we know that it works after 3 days. This is perhaps an indication that 3 days is a possible upper limit, if not possibly more. How this approach differs from others is that what they've done, rather than keep the liver in a cold environment and minimize metabolic activity, is they've kept it at a normothermic temperature, that is, normal body temperature of about 36 degrees Celsius. They've also continued to pump the necessary quasi-blood and other hormones through it, in an attempt to remove waste, provide oxygen, and nutrition. This means the liver is effectively being kept in what it views as a normal human body in a normal biological state. This means the liver has no reason to start breaking down or do anything else that would otherwise negatively affect its viability. Still on the topic of transplants, but rather than focusing on the role of transplants from someone else, a self-transplant. This involved the development of an ear from someone's own cells, and then transplanting it back onto their body. The way it works is they created what is basically a 3D print of the necessary structure around which the cells would then grow. These cells were then populated around this and they were left to grow and develop. Eventually it got to a point where the material could be moved onto the host, the person who had already donated the cells, and by doing so could then become a functioning ear. The original printed design is intended to be degradable and will break down over time, allowing the cartilage-type cells that are in there to proliferate and replace it. This gives you the framework, and around which the necessary epithelial or skin cells will grow. This turns the early ear into a fully grown ear as it matures over time, which makes it a more naturally occurring product. This is done in lieu of grafting an entire, completely developed ear onto the host, which is a much bigger structure and much more difficult to get to line up and hook up to all the necessary blood vessels, nerves, and so on. Going from medical news that is new developments to medical news that is going to point out some fairly obvious facts for some people. A study confirming that tall people can be prone to certain diseases that other people are not. This is not going to be things like back pain from reaching for the bottom shelf, but rather more fundamental diseases, things like varicose veins. It really shouldn't come as a surprise. The taller you are, the more distance things like blood has to go around your body. This means to some extent it will begin pooling in certain parts. This is because it takes time for blood pressure to build up and force blood back to the heart. Once you have a reduction in the movement of blood, you'll find that other conditions tend to stem from this. On top of that, you need to consider the requirements of growing into a tall person. There is much greater demand on the body, even if you are given proper nutrition throughout the entire developmental life cycle. The chances are that the taller you are and the bigger you are in general, the more thinly stretched resources will be during that time. This may partially explain why things like peripheral neuropathy and lower extremity ulcers are more common. This could explain why people who are taller tend to be at risk of certain cancers to a greater extent than those who are shorter. This is not all doom and gloom if you happen to be tall. There are benefits to this in terms of risk factors. Chances are you have a lower risk of cardiovascular diseases and a lower risk of coronary heart disease. The strength of this study is largely based on its size. It is a very large study involving 100 clinical trials and about 1,000 participants. That is a lot of data to support what's being said, and the fact that they're combining not only clinical observations but genetics means you can begin to find correlations, but correlation, as always, does not equal causation. We'll go now to a case study, and one that would probably put the past analysis of 1 million veterans in context of how important these things are for some. The woman presented to a hospital with flesh-eating bacteria. As is the unfortunate reality, these tend to crop up every now and then. It was coming out of her right breast, and this is already a particularly unfortunate thing. Only 6 months prior, she had noticed that there was a lump developing in the same breast, and, being of course advised to take homeopathic treatments, chose not to follow up with health professionals. After presenting to someone who could actually treat her with a foul-smelling discharge from her breast, with the lump, they identified that it was a bacterial infection and cancer. Something that could have been addressed much earlier on if they had seen an actual medical professional, not a homeopath. There are two aspects to this story that are noteworthy. One, that about 20% of people who get flesh-eating bacteria or necrotising fasciitis will die from it. That's because it progresses very quickly, is very aggressive, and quickly leads to other infections, otherwise known as sepsis. Sepsis being infection of the blood from which it travels to every part of your body and starts destroying it. The other element is the fact that the breast cancer itself could have begun to metastasize to other locations, creating secondary cancers that create their own issues. In order to resolve the issues, two things had to happen. One was that they had to treat the infection, which was done with antibiotics, but they also had to conduct a mastectomy on her right breast. The cancer was then treated with chemotherapy and radiotherapy. We'll round up the medical news for now with this particular article coming from Science-Based Medicine, and it's about the emerging prevalence of a market for antivirals, notably a black market. People believe that they can get medication for just about every disease now, and to a certain extent it is true. There may be medicine available, but whether or not that medicine is warranted or going to be effective is a different question. This is why the emerging black market for antivirals has begun to exist. There are two drugs at the moment that are currently in the pipeline for approval specifically for COVID. One of these comes from Merck and is shown to show up to a 30% reduction in hospitalizations and a 50% reduction in death. Pfizer's offering has had a 89% efficacy compared to placebos. This means that between the two of them you certainly have a better option. But the question is, firstly, are they actually valid in the claims made? And secondly, if they are valid, is it actually necessary for someone to be given these antivirals if they already have a very low risk of proceeding onto a more severe form of COVID? If you are already effectively going to be someone who has no symptoms, what need is there for you to have these antivirals if you have no chance of getting a more severe form anyway? This is how the black market becomes important. It allows distribution of these drugs, and others for that matter, when they don't need to be given out. That, of course, is premised on the assumption that all of these are going to be perfectly side effect free drugs, or at least relatively side effect free. We don't know that yet. The clinical trials have not been conducted on the scale required to be able to get that knowledge. It's one of the reasons why it took quite some time for COVID-19 vaccines to be released. They needed a large enough data set from people who'd taken part in stage 3 trials to figure out the kind of side effects seen on a large scale. Even when you then release them to the public, you're going to discover new side effects that weren't apparent, because people are diverse, different, and generally tend to be a pain in the ass when it comes to medication, because they will find anything and everything to complain about if they think it is related to a particular medicine. The final news item we have for you this week is technology focused and is about the most powerful supercomputer that has now been made. It is able to do more than a quintillion calculations a second. Consider trying to mine a cryptocurrency with that, and you would begin to get the idea that it's pretty damn powerful. It's theorized that the entire Bitcoin network would have about 800 petaflops of capacity. A very rough conversion of the power of this system to the same sort of processing capability is just under 14,000 exaflops. This is still a factor of 10, but also a factor of 10 plus several thousands. Another comparison would be the Xbox Series S. It has about 12.1 teraflops. A teraflop is 10 to the 12th power, and exaflop is 10 to the 18th power. This is an incredibly powerful computer. The previous leader, Fugaku, based out of the Riken Center for Computational Science in Japan, had 0.4 exaflops. So this is nearly 3 times as powerful as that computer, and it was claimed only a couple of years ago. The rate of increase is phenomenal. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Please post any comments, questions, or suggestions that you have below.